Thank you for auditing Professor Skye's Record Review, the always positive new music review show hosted by a French professor who's going to be tackling the new album by Bruce Springsteen, Letter to You. Now, with an artist like Bruce Springsteen, we have to deal with the weight of legend, the weight of respect and admiration, somebody whose top critical scores are already assured, whose profile on NPR has already been made, somebody who has become a living cultural legend. And in becoming a living cultural legend, has in some ways already died. With his legacy assured, with everything all in place, everything that he does, everything he's done really for the last 20 years has been just another thing, another addition to his great legacy. And the question that I ask about these kinds of artists like Bob Dylan or like Bruce Springsteen, is are they undying or are they undead? Undying being the positive version of it, meaning they just keep going and they keep making music and they're full of life. Or are they artistically undead, incapable of making things that are new and interesting, but just kind of shuffling out there like a Halloween zombie, trying to figure out some way to keep cashing in or keep regurgitating the same material? I would argue that a group like the Rolling Stones are undead, whereas artists like Bruce Springsteen are undying. That is to say, still vital, still meaningful, and what they make is of importance. The thing is, though, is that Bruce Springsteen was not always this way. So I want to give you a little history lesson. A history lesson from somebody who's 43 years old, a child of the 90s, grew up during the grunge era, and I can tell you Bruce Springsteen was not always Bruce Springsteen. For me and many in my generation, he was that douche in a headband. He was the born in the USA guy who we falsely thought of as a cheerleader for Ronald Reagan. The opposite was, of course, true. For me, he was this jerk who called himself the boss. Like, how douchey and lame. The boss. Like, I was a rebel. I'm not gonna like someone who calls himself the boss. The only other the boss was Tony Danza on the TV show Who's the Boss? And yes, when I was a kid, I didn't understand that Tony Danza and Bruce Springsteen were completely different people. On some level, they both kind of fit into that same kind of working class, cool guy chic that I didn't understand as a 10-year-old growing up in suburban Boston. So for me, he was not at all this giant of music, not for a long time. I listened to two kinds of radio growing up, classic rock and alternative rock. Bruce Springsteen was nowhere to be found on classic rock radio stations. He was just too popular in the 80s, I suppose. I don't know why. I don't know why they didn't play music from The River or from Born to Run or from any of his early albums. They just didn't. They did not play Bruce Springsteen. And he sure as hell wasn't alternative rock. He wasn't edgy. He was just some aging rock dinosaur. All of this was made worse by this kind of bizarre false dichotomy that developed when I was in high school, where I knew a couple people who liked Bruce, but very often it was always this false dichotomy was developed between Bruce Springsteen and Neil Young. You either liked one or the other. One of my favorite things about Bruce Springsteen was a quote I read from him when I was in high school, and I still thought of him as that douche in a headband, or bandana, I guess. I remember him talking about Neil Young's fans, like me, and he was like, if Neil Young released an album of just crickets, all of his fans would buy it. And this was at the ebb of Bruce Springsteen's career, where fewer and fewer people were attending his concerts or buying his albums. This is true. Neil Young fans would buy albums of just crickets. And this sort of emphasized to me, this reinforced this idea that this was the great dichotomy. But now understanding it, it's not a very good dichotomy at all. Both of them are touring greats who are able to put on concerts as good now as they did 40 years ago. Both have stayed true to themselves. Both take good enough care of themselves to be healthy enough to continue to make good music. Both of them had made albums in their 50s and 60s and now 70s that are as good as their albums in their 20s. Basically, both of them are and have remained undying, never whack. I think to a certain extent they're both also under the protective wing of the legend of Bob Dylan. Neither of them have to bear the weight of the voice of a generation completely alone. They will always be sub-Dylans, like underneath those giant arms that seem to obscure everything underneath them. He can absorb the weight of an expression, the voice of a generation, which of course is complete horse hockey. Now the thing is, it took me a long time to like Bruce Springsteen. As I said, I actively disliked him. And there are a lot of things about Bruce Springsteen that I find difficult to love, even though I am now a fan. His affected singing style, okay? Just the way he kind of has it. Sometimes he's got a southern drawl. I thought you were from New Jersey, right? I don't know where that comes from. And the kind of drawl, he's always trying to sound so earnest and so sincere. And it's like he's a multimillionaire. You know, how do we get that? The sort of 2, 3, 4. But you know, I love Mick Jagger, speaking of the Rolling Stones. Is he any less affected than Bruce Springsteen? Of course not. Why do I hold Bruce Springsteen to a higher account? Perhaps Bruce Springsteen's most interesting and most distinctive vocal habit over the years is at the end of a song going, whoo, which I used to hate. But then, I don't know, I liked Bono, I liked U2. They stole the whoo at the end of a song. Tom York from Radiohead stole that from Bono. So really, a lot of the things that I think I hate about Bruce Springsteen, I don't. The one thing which I definitively dislike and continue to dislike about his style. Now, understand, these are just the opinions of one professor of French. These are not the opinions of anybody who thinks his opinion is right. I can't stand the saxophone. Rest in peace, Clarence Clemens. He seemed like he was a wonderful guy, but I hate his presence in the music. Every time a Bruce Springsteen song comes on and a saxophone comes on, it's like that feeling I get when I hear a particularly bad harmonica solo from Bob Dylan, but just way worse. Because the emotion that they're trying to get is like, yeah! And I just don't want that emotion from my music. I hate those blistering saxophone solos. I don't care much for the organ either, the way that it's used. It's part of what makes Bruce Springsteen an interesting character, especially for someone like me, who spent his entire life sort of trying to figure out what is cool and what is funky and all that. Like, Bruce Springsteen's always been kind of on the line between good and cheesy, but he's never really been cool. Now, the truth is that it goes beyond cool. That my, young appreciation of Neil Young and denigration of Bruce Springsteen was a lack of depth on my part. It was superficiality. If we actually look at the lyrics of Bruce Springsteen, the message behind Bruce Springsteen throughout the years, it's probably as profound, if not more profound, than Neil Young. But it just didn't have that cool guy feeling, because he was just too pop. So how did I get through this? How did I come to love Bruce Springsteen? I'm pretty lucky, because by the early 2000s, all of a sudden, popular culture, and if you remember this, by the way, could you put this in the comments that I'm not crazy? Out of nowhere, popular culture just put a crown on him and said, he is the king of music. He is ageless. He makes great concerts. We never doubted him for a second. I'm telling you, in the 90s, the Bruce Springsteen fan club had the diehards, and that was it. I managed to get into Bruce Springsteen right before this phase, just simply because of maybe the best thing about Bruce Springsteen, which are his fans. I happen to be friends with a guy in college named Blair. He's the same guy who got me into the Beach Boys. He was like, I had my preconceptions, like, oh, that Kokomo band? No, listen to Pet Sounds. Bruce Springsteen, oh, the douche with a bandana? No. Have a listen to Nebraska. And so I had to listen to Nebraska, and I was like, oh, I was wrong. And so I went out and I got as much as I could at that time. I got Ashbury Park, Ghost of Tom Joad, E Street Shuffle, probably my personal favorite, Darkness at the Edge of Town. And if you're out there, Blair, I lost contact with him. I had a little bit of a falling out. I still have your disc 2 of The River. So hit me up, man. Put in the comments, hey Skye, how's it going? Because that's don't you hate that when you lose one disc of a double disc set? So through that, I learned to appreciate and love it. And in particular, I have learned to love Bruce Springsteen fans. Any artist or any group, any genre of anything that has really hardcore fans, it's really worth spending time figuring out what is it that they love. If for nothing else, you can have much more interesting conversations with those people about that than about other things. There's a colleague in 17th century studies with me who is a very good scholar in 17th century French literature and theater and all that, and I could talk about that. But turns out she's also a mega Bruce fan. So whenever I see her, I just want to talk about Bruce Springsteen, you know, because there's like when you meet people who are like super passionate about an artist, like that's a really good way to connect that goes beyond just like, oh, how's the weather, or oh, gee, I don't know, how your pet's doing. Anyways, so so that's how I ended up learning to like Bruce Springsteen. But I never went full. I never went super fan. I don't own everything. I saw him in concert twice. Well, no, I bought concert tickets twice. First time I couldn't go. Second time I went. It was amazing. Just as good as they say. I can't believe he is as old as he is, giving as much as he does. If for nothing else, he should get all the credit in the universe for being able to give so much to Rochester, New York, in the middle of, I don't know, spring. To be able to give so much at this age, it was amazing. I will say this album, and I'm going to get to the album, 10 minutes in, I haven't even talked about the album yet. There is another thing that's kind of was blocking me from wanting to review this. It's a dad album, and I don't mean to gender this, but I'm just going to tell you why. Like, when I was growing up, like, my friends' parents would, like, get tapes or CDs for Christmas. And you could tell it was like, people would buy them tapes or CDs of artists that they remember from their youth that had just come out. So it ended up that like there'd be all these kind of like okay albums or good albums. The best example is my friend Brad's dad loved Paul Simon. So he had copies of Graceland in both of his cars, like cassette copies of Graceland in both of his cars. There is something about this album, its release date in the fall, where it does feel like it's kind of designed to be like a good Christmas gift for your Bruce-loving dad, but I don't know. That's my weird snobbery. So if I sound like an obnoxious snob, please know, I know that. I am intentionally showing that to you so that you can see it. Feel free to criticize it, but I'm just trying to like talk about what are the filters? Why is it that some people don't embrace Bruce Springsteen? I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. There's also a weird thing where with some of his fans, especially who are male fans, speaking of fathers, there's like a weird relationship to Bruce Springsteen where he's very fatherly. And like when people like, there's a kind of like stunted masculine psychology, which is searching, right? It hasn't given up. It's not just like saying, forget it, I'm just going to be lost in a sea of toxic masculinity, but like searching, and often they sort of land on Bruce Springsteen as just sort of like this sort of surrogate father, somebody who is in touch with his emotions, but is also tough enough to go street racing or whatever. So that's another weird thing, which I think is interesting to study, but also maybe created a block. As far as this particular album, the main thing that stopped me from wanting to review it is I saw it, this is the cover, I was like, is this a commercial for LL Bean? Like seriously, like, are they selling this jacket at LL Bean? He just looks like, you know, he looks like a model who's like sitting there and he's in the snow. And there's something about it, I just kind of thought, I'm not going to listen to it. But then I did. And it is an amazing album. And this is the thing, my wife, who's from Serbia, she doesn't know much about Bruce Springsteen. I was trying to explain it to her. I was trying to explain Bruce to her. And I'm like, I'm not a super fan of Bruce. I don't love Bruce, but I definitely like him a lot. And the thing that I'll say is that this album is as good as any other Bruce Springsteen album. 71 years old, releases an album. I like this as much as I like Born to Run or The River. It's that good. And that is insanely impressive to be making music this good this late into your career. It is intimate and bombastic in equal measure. And I think that's what Bruce Springsteen does particularly well, is he has that bombastic side, the Clarence Clemens, you know, he has that whole sort of like big rock band and 2, 3, 4, and that stuff's okay. But what makes Bruce so great is his ability to mix that with a very personal, very intimate, more acoustic, less electric, like one person as opposed to 15 people making the music. And this album is a great mixture of both. I mean, too often, like, you know, when I go through his back catalog, you know, this is way too much, and then this is too much just intimate. Like, his best stuff, I think, is when they're mixed together, and that's what we have here. Apparently, I watched an interview with him just as preparation, and also he's a fun person to watch interviewed. I watched the interview with Zane Lowe. If you haven't watched it, check it out. He's very proud of the fact that this was made with no demos. And so it's just made with the E Street Band, the surviving members of the E Street Band, and he made it in 4 days. And it does have that immediacy, it does feel that direct, it does not feel overproduced. For the most part, the album, this is a trick. You'd think it's about death, okay? If you had to pick one theme that appears the most, you'd say it's about death. But it's not about death. It's more about not dying. It's about the recognition of life through death. And then through that death, you have to find the meaning of life and what makes life worth living. So it's not like this late stage style album where it's somebody who knows that the Grim Reaper's at their door. It's more like, what is life like? What matters in here? And I think that's what makes it such a great album. Because if it was just an album that was like Time Out of Mind by Bob Dylan, which is a great album, but or some song that's like a meditation on death, this is actually, I'm just gonna say it, it's a meditation on life that comes with the wisdom of being old and watching your friends die. I'm lucky enough not to have experienced that. But another thing about this album, and this was mentioned by one of my auditors, Our Family in Motion, who suggested I review this, he did mention that this album has kind of a ring theory to it, meaning that like the beginning and the end echo each other, leading into the center. And it is definitely true thematically. Around the center, there are 2 songs that are this sort of spiritual center, The Power of Prayer, which is about prayer through music, House of 1,000 Guitars, which is basically about a church of music. And then sort of halfway through the first half, halfway through the second half, there are songs about the last member of his first band dying. And then the second song and the second to last song are sort of super bombastic. And then the very end, you have like this opening track, which sort of exists as a sort of intro to the fleeting nature of life. So it is pretty cool that he's able to sort of like create a structure to this album, which has this immediacy of like, it's a super quick 4 days I recorded it, but also there's a real structure to it, where it's like meditations on life and death, meditation for someone who's lost, prayer, and music. Very visual. So let me go track by track and explain to you what I think about this album, because I think that's the best way to do it. It opens up with something called 1 Minute You're Here. And this is kind of a I'm gonna die song, kind of cliche ridden, right? Because 1 minute you're here, 1 minute you're gone, that's a cliche. Long black train is death. But what's nice is at one point in here he says, baby, baby, I'm so alone. And I actually feel the pain in that. That's the thing about Bruce. Sometimes he's so earnest, you don't know if he even believes what he's saying. He just seems like he's just wearing everything on his sleeve so much. But there's something about this that's quite nice. It is interesting too that he sings 1 minute you're here, the next minute you're gone. I suppose he's talking about himself, but this also appears to really be a long reflection on the people who he's lost in his life. I thought I knew just who I was and what I do, but I was wrong. 1 minute you're here, next minute I'm gone. There is a very revealing quote from the Zane Lowe interview where he says that life is short but long. And that kind of Yogi Berra style wisdom, I think works pretty well for this album. Life is short but long. I think that is kind of the thesis to the album. Letter to You, so like the first 2 tracks, I'll explain, they're built together. Like they're supposed to be listened to in one. Where almost like 1 minute you're here is like a preface or like an intro to Letter to You, which is upbeat, piano lead lines undercut by just this rock organ that I just hate. I hate the sound of the organ on this song. It's okay, it's still a good track. He's singing kind of fun, like he says the word blue in a kind of campy but nice way. There's a huge instrumental outro. It feels that a lot of these songs are built for concerts, which will hopefully happen soon, but who knows with COVID. And the wonderful ambition of this falsely simple album is shown in these 2 songs. 1 minute you're here, Letter to You. 1 minute you're here explains the problem of mortality, okay? Letter to You explains the solution to the problem of mortality. In his particular case, the solution for him is to make music for the people who care about him, right? So that's his connection to people. And in a way, Bruce Springsteen is doing what people have been doing for centuries, especially French philosophers, especially the existentialists, who understand that the only way out of the absurdity of human existence is through human connection. That's what he's able to do on these first two tracks. The problem is we're all going to die. The answer is let's all be together and write each other letters and connect and make music and pray together through this ethereal thing of life, through this ethereal thing of music. It's really earnest, and you might think it's cheesy. But if you think it's cheesy, that just means you're being like 20-year-old edgelord Skye. I just like Neil Young, man. Bruce is too cheesy, man. No, this is great. This is an amazing work of art just in those first two songs. The Problem and Solution to Mortality. Brought to you by The Boss. I still can't get behind The Boss. Next track, Burnin' Train, has kind of a droning guitar, shuffling rhythms. I wonder if there's a click track on this song. It's okay. It seems like kind of a filler track, but it's nice. It's nice and upbeat. Leads into Jenny Needs a Shooter. This is going to be a long one, guys and girls and everybody. So, this is the thing. Jenny Needs a Shooter was a song that he allegedly wrote in 1971. And apparently, his manager or somebody related to him was talking to Warren Zevon. Warren Zevon heard the title, Jenny Needs a Shooter, and on this album wrote his own song called Jeannie Needs a Shooter. Now this song, one of my favorite Warren Zevon songs. It's hard to pick, Warren Zevon's so good. So it's this weird thing where like I had this other song stuck in my head that was like a misinterpretation of an old Bruce song. This is cool, it's kind of slow, it's got that damn organ back in it again, but this is the thing. The worst part of this album are the three songs that are old Bruce Springsteen songs that came before his first album. Thematically, I understand. This album is a lot about the power of music. It's about the power of memory. It's about connecting to who you were as you were younger and reflecting how that influences the way you are now. In that context, the three songs from before Bruce Springsteen wrote his first album absolutely belong here. Thematically, perfect. Awesome, Bruce. Thank you. Musically, no. This is not good. Like, these songs are before Bruce Springsteen became a great songwriter. They were still in his early phase where he was kind of trying to do the Bob Dylan, half sensical, half poetical, kind of silly, tongue-in-cheek. It's just all so painfully wannabe Dylan music. It's just too rudimentary. He has so surpassed this in his songwriting. I mean, he surpassed it by the time he got to Asbury Park, but still. And I realized what it's like. If you ever go to a museum and have a retrospective of an artist, like the first room is terrible. It's the juvenilia, the work that was done by the artist before they attained their mature style. And everyone just kind of shuffles through there because that's not what they're known for. And then by the end of the gallery, you've seen all the famous things that they're famous for, and you don't want to see juvenilia, not even redone in the new style. If you take an example, Jean Dubuffet exhibit I went to in Korea a while ago, you know, this is the style that he's known for, right? These sort of strong lines, abstract faces, a lot of sort of diagonal red, whites, and blues. And you know, this is how he started. That was his early style. So if you're going to a Jean Dubuffet exhibit, you're going to see this, and you know it's going to lead into that. But what you don't want to see is like reinterpretations of this in the new style. It just doesn't feel necessary. And that's what this is. That's what these three tracks are. They are redoing his juvenilia. Thematically works, but stylistically, it doesn't ruin the album. It's still a great album. But yeah, it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it. Next track, Last Man Standing. When I read the title, I was like, oh dear God. I hope this isn't about the Tim Allen TV show. It's not. This is one of two songs about the lead singer of his previous band who recently died, and it's all about his friends dying. okay. The song isn't that great. Again, it's maybe one of the weaker tracks on the album. But it's nice, and it's particularly nice in the way that it's paired with Ghosts later. Like, it seems like Bruce is really working through this pain. And I hope to reach an age where I have this difficult phase of my life, right? I mean, it's coming for all of us if we're lucky. If we're lucky enough to have friends. If we're lucky enough to have people to lose, then we will be unlucky enough to lose them. And it seems as though he's working through them in this super earnest, super direct way. Then the track, The Power of Prayer. It's just a bad song. I don't like this one. It's just bad. I'm sorry. Listen, Bob Dylan fans are animals. They hate me because... I don't know why Bob Dylan fans hate me. I said he was the greatest, but I had some bad things to say about his new album, which is a great album. Not as good as this Bruce Springsteen album, by the way. But still, this track, I don't know. Tons of cliches, ship of fools, it's a fixed game, going all in. The most Clarence Clemency of all the tracks with the saxophone, just a kind of annoying wheedling melody. Its only saving grace is the way that it fits thematically in the album. And that's maybe a thing that's happening now a lot throughout this album, where Jenny Needs a Shooter and these other early tracks fit thematically but not musically, because Power of Prayer is matched really well with the other centerpiece of the album, House of a Thousand Guitars, which is super awesome. So if you're here and you're going, Skye, how dare you say bad things about a Bruce song? This is great. A piano song, which is kind of funny. It's very piano-led, even though it's a song about 1,000 guitars. A kind of brief anti-Trump message, which I'm going to get to soon on the next track. But then it's like, it has like a church organ in the back, and this is the sense that we're getting, where he's talking about the spirituality, where he's trying to overcome the spirituality. He's trying to overcome like death. He's trying to overcome the sense of loss by making music and connecting people through this House of 1,000 Guitars, which is like a church of music. And according to the Zane Lowe album, this is the whole point of the album. Overcoming death through human connection. In this case, the human connection is music. It's basically overcoming death with music, but I don't want to simplify it too much. I also want to do a little bit of advertising. It's not paid advertising, it's free advertising. But I don't know if this is on purpose, but the greatest guitar store in the world is in Rochester, New York, my hometown now. And it's called the House of Guitars. Do you see how their logo intentionally looks like a church? I am positive Bruce Springsteen has been to the House of Guitars. When you go into the House of Guitars, it is a complete mess. There are guitars everywhere. The people who ran it, I think they met Jimi Hendrix back in the 60s. They've been there for that long. They're like local legends. But it has that kind of sacred feeling, a kind of sacred, dirty rock and roll feeling. I don't know if that's on purpose, but if you're ever in Rochester, go to the House of Guitars. It's an amazingly frustrating, wonderful experience, much like church. Speaking of political, we then get to the track Rainmaker. Now the thing is about Bruce, and I was explaining this to my wife yesterday, he is maybe the only efficient Hollywood celebrity when it comes to being a liberal or to being a leftist. Because his music is so intentionally blue-collar, he forces, and his audience is largely blue-collar, he forces them to understand the relationship between the values of the left and the working class. Like where right now in American politics, for the most part, the working class has been co-opted by Fox News, espousing the values of individualism and trickle-down economics. Bruce Springsteen does not let his fans, he doesn't let them off the hook. He forces them to confront this fact. He forces his many, many, many conservative fans to deal with the fact that their idol believes in something different than they do. And he makes the most convincing argument for it. So I give him a pass for all this political stuff. It's not like Madonna, right? It's not like Madonna being making her album about Bush or whatever. It's like when it comes from Bruce, there is an authority and there is an audience. There's a meaningful group of people who he is influencing. And he is influencing them quite well. And this is a good track. It seems like it could be about Trump. It could be about any bad politician. But it's about the idea of people living in a drought. And they therefore worship somebody who calls himself the Rainmaker. Obviously, there is no such thing as a Rainmaker. So it's a funny idea. Here's the lyrics. At the end, it gets a little bit patronizing, which is maybe the biggest problem with Bruce's political stuff. Is it's sort of like, I know what you don't know. They come because they can't stand the pain, another long hot day of no rain, because they don't care or understand what it really takes for the sky to open up the land. But still, it's a really good track. There's like not many good anti-Trump songs in existence. Certainly, like most of them are rap, and they're just briefly mentioned. This, I would say, is a positively strong message because it's a little bit more universal. And I would say it's a little bit more universal about the way that the working class is abused and taken advantage of by the conservative forces in this country. It's interesting. Does this song have an intentional echo of his song Glory Days? I can't sing. I think in the background, it's supposed to sound a little bit like Glory Days. And this is my theory. There's a strong link between conservatism and nostalgia. And the song Glory Days itself is a very nostalgic song. And I imagine that his most conservative fans like that because it's like back when things were good, back when America was great again, right? Is he intentionally kind of echoing Glory Days, like seizing it and recontextualizing it and making it an anti-conservative message? I don't know. That's kind of far out there. If you're one of the Bruce fans who hasn't left me because I said Power of Prayer is a bad song, let me know. Next track is If I Were a Priest, another one of his old songs, like super southern accent. It's musically, it's actually quite good. It's quite solid. But lyrically, we're just back in the, gee, I wish I were Bob Dylan. Let me just throw out some biblical religious terms and just see Jesus was a sheriff and I were a priest, a shotgun and too many outlaws. It's okay. It's fine. It's fine juvenilia, but not as good as the rest of the album. That said, there's a great guitar solo, and I bet this song is going to be insane in concert because he gives it so much space to perform at the end. Then the track Ghosts is another one about his dead lead singer, spirits filled with light. It's nice how the chorus is about how he's alive. Like, Bruce is singing about being alive. And again, this is not an album about death. It's an album about not dying. It's about not dying and apparently buckskin jackets. That's a really important theme in this album. It's very earnest. And that's another question where, is that why young Skye rejected Bruce Springsteen? Because I was too afraid to be earnest. Did I need irony? Did I need distance? I don't know. It's a little too much like, back in the old days, we killed them. Because like, Bruce, you still killed them. I saw you at the Rochester War Memorial. You killed us. You did a great job. But very intentionally at the end, it seems like they get kind of an earworm going, a really nice hook that feels, again, that's destined for the stadium. So in 2022, whenever it is, he comes back to Rochester. I'm going to be there. I'll wear a headband, just for my audience. I'll wear the headband, and I'll get excited for the song, which isn't even one of my top 5 favorite songs on this album. The track Song for Orphans is another one of these Bob Dylan songs. Okay, move on to the last song. I'll See You in My Dreams, which is the perfect ending, which matches the one second you're here, the next second you're gone. And it's just kind of moving on. And this is sort of his way of saying, I will see you in my dreams. Death is not the end. This is also the way of keeping people alive. So he's keeping this lead singer alive through his dreams and through his songs. And that's how they will stay alive. And more importantly, mixed together with a letter to you, like by telling us these stories, he will help us better mediate our own existence. Did I just become a super fan? That's like really awesome. That's really cool. It's a really great album. I'm very glad I reviewed it. Whew. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. If you're like a super Bruce fan and there's something I missed, could you please tell me? Because I know there's so much to him, and I have nothing but respect for super Bruce fans, unlike those Dylan bastards. I'm just kidding. Actually, I'm not. Dylan fans are really toxic. It's insane. I don't know why. Like, could you get more than a Nobel Prize and all the praise in the world? Does everybody have to like everything he's ever done? Okay. Well, anyways, tell me if I missed anything. Until next time, I'm going to review something a little bit less well-known than Bruce, I think, next. I want to hear some new music. But until then, enjoying this old music, this old new music, this new old music. There's the camera.